data science, whatever, lab 1.
Okay. Perfect. I think I'm good. Thanks for jumping on. That was easier than I was expecting.
Yeah, once it's set up, it's actually fairly good. Okay, I'll hang around for a minute in case there are any questions, but I'll turn off my video and mute myself.
Okay, perfect. Where do you actually change the title of the video?
There is a, like, once you go live, I think then it asks you to do that, but I can do that in post.
Okay. I may have skipped that step. It's Devin Lang's personal meeting room for the time being.
Okay, that's not a problem. We can change it on YouTube.
Okay. Cool. I'll get started. The beginning of the demo is a little bit administrative, so I'll give people a chance to trickle in. I'm going to share my screen here. Cool. Thank you for joining us and being flexible with outages and everything. What I have planned for today is a brief section if there's any lingering questions for homework 1. After that, it's going to be essentially a quick boot camp on like how I actually do development. It's worth noting that there's many ways you can do it, and there isn't necessarily one correct way, but if you aren't familiar with this should be a good place to start. And then after that, we're going to go into a little bit more programming technical detail on some things that you have seen before, but really things related to homework 2, in particular D3 and recursion. So before we move on to new stuff, are there any questions on the homework 1 that you should all have submitted already? Feel free to unmute yourself or post in chat or raise your hand.
I kind of had a question.
Mm-hmm.
This homework 1 was kind of seemed similar to like the 5 submission type thing, the submissions that we had to make. We've only had one possible submission so far. Is that correct?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
These are usually accompanied by theory lectures, and well, these have gotten pushed or canceled so far. Next theory lecture, we'll have another one.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to assume that has answered your question. Cool. So in terms of actually doing development, we're going to go over three main components using an IDE, some ways that you can do debugging while doing web development, and running a server, which will be necessary for doing some of this stuff. So an IDE, if you don't know, is an acronym, stands for Integrated Development Environment, and it's like writing code in a text file, but it has a lot of really useful functionality built into it. And I would say you really, if you aren't already, you should be using some kind of IDE. With the TAs of this class and our lab, it seems like pretty unanimously VS Code is the one that is used. It's what I use. It's free. It's relatively easy to use out of the box compared to a lot of them. And one thing that I like about it in particular is there's a large community that makes extensions for it, which makes it very adaptable to a lot of situations. So for instance, I'm using just a couple examples from my experience the last couple of weeks. I'm using this like data format, and it has its own specific syntax. And VS Code doesn't have anything for that built in, but there's a protobuf is the data structure, data format, and it does have an extension that does all the syntax highlighting and auto-completion for that. One I started using recently for markdown files is Grammarly, which if you're a grad student, you actually have a premium account for, and there is actually an extension for VS Code for Grammarly that can do this sort of like spell checking and grammar checking in the same way it can do, code checking. Yeah, and to start with, I'm just going to kind of go through a demo of what a simple workflow might look for me. So first, I'm just going to open VS Code, and that's going to be off screen, but let me pull this over here. And I have a new window for Visual Studio Code. So they've got this little welcome page. I often start by opening a folder or a workspace. In this case, I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call that Lab 1 Demo. So just an empty folder, and I will open that up. And in here, you can see a number of options. The first option is like a directory. It shows that folder and everything that's in it. Right now, we see a big blank space because there's nothing in it. Folder or workspace. In this case, I'm gonna. And sounds like I'm getting some echo. So if you are unmuted and don't have a question, if you can mute yourself, that'd be great. So the first thing I'm gonna do actually is start from a GitHub page, which is something that happens fairly frequently. And I've just made this sort of really simple GitHub page with a single HTML file on it. And if you look at this green download button, there's a few options for getting this code on your computer. I personally like to just copy the path to this directory, which happens when you click this little clipboard. And then in here, you can actually open up a terminal right within this environment, which I use all the time. So if you see this bottom, half of the screen, it's showing a terminal. And this is your sort of like command line interface into functions and directories in your computer. And I have GitHub installed, so I can clone that directory, and I clone that specific one by giving that particular path. And now if we look over here, we have a new directory with a new file in it. And this file has this single HTML file. And one way that you can actually view this in your browser without a server is to, let me open up a new tab and command open. And if I go to, here we go, this file, you can actually just open up a specific file directly in the browser. And we don't see anything because there's really nothing in this file. But if we add one element, and as I'm typing here, you can see some of the benefits of using IDE. I've started typing in H and it lists all of these tags that exist in HTML. And you see similar things in different languages. And if I hit enter, it completes it. And as I finish that starting tag, it actually automatically populates that closing tag. So it takes away a lot of the tedious nature of programming, in my opinion. So if we add some text to this and save it, we can go back to this file, which we've opened directly, and refresh, and we see that first header. And I do want to point out at this point that this approach is going to fail for us at a certain point, which is why we will need this Python server. But we will get to that point. Let me pause if there are any questions so far. Cool.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What browser are you demonstrating with?
Yeah, so this is Google Chrome.
Okay.
Chrome is, again, obviously not the only choice, but it is a popular choice for doing web development, just because they have good support for a lot of different features, and they also have quite a few useful tools for like debugging and looking at your code.
So better than Safari?
It's somewhat subjective.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I use Chrome. Most of the people that I know use Chrome, but
okay, good to know.
Yeah. Cool. So we see here are a couple of commented out commands. If I press command / that will uncomment it. And here we are pulling in a new style sheet. So if I command new, a new file, and add some styling rules for that H1 header, I can say, give it a background of red. And you see here, all of the text is white. That's because it's styling it as plain text. And when we save it, it will change automatically to CSS, but we can also manually go in and say, this is CSS. So let me just save this. We get the fun Zoom covering up things. We call that style.css, which matches this style.css when we've uncommented that. So let's save that and refresh, and we get this glaring red background. Now, if you want to sort of tweak these things live, the debugging tools here can definitely be useful for that. I use this all the time. And with this feature here, you can quickly select into this element, right? So we have this HTML repeated here, as well as the styles are listed here. So here, this style background red is here, and I can actually just double click into that. It's a little finicky sometimes. And change it, or even some of these have like nice little widgets for modifying them here. And I can, modify other things in here as well, like giving these a border, or really any of the standard CSS styles that you want. So this is something I use fairly frequently for like sort of quickly tweaking the styles and seeing those results immediately, as opposed to sort of switching back and forth repeatedly. In addition to the CSS file, we have a commented main file in the same way. We have can create a new file, and I've prepared a couple sort of stub functions that I'm going to just paste in here quickly. And here we have two functions. And if we want to run these from our HTML, one way you can do this is just by quickly adding a button. So if we do this button, just say click me, and then one of the attributes of that element is going to be on click. Here again, you can see all of the things that you can add here. This is what we want in this case. And this is the function name. And in this case, we actually want those parentheses because this is what will be run. So if we refresh this, you'll notice those styles that I modified here are lost. So changing them here will not change them in your file. They're more of like a temporary tweak that you can then copy over after you've decided on something. But we do have this button, and if we click it, we get this alert, which if we look back in here corresponds to this first line of the function. And the alert is something that generally you probably don't want to use that often, but because it brings up this pop-up that you have to click OK to get through. And then the next few lines, you'll see the result of in this console page. So the first line we see console.log. This is a useful way for just spitting out text into the console. The second is a variant of that, which is this console.error, which is the same principle, except it looks like an error. You get the red styling, and then here we see what an error looks like. Might look like in the console. So we can see that this happens on main.js on line 6, and if we click here, it actually goes directly to that line in this sources tab of your debugging window. So if I open this up a little bit more, we can see it's this line, and it's telling us that D3 is not defined. Okay, and the reason for that is I don't have it added to the HTML file yet. So if I add that here, we have our D3, we save it, and then if we refresh, click this, we get OK. And now we have a new problem, right? So the missing reference to D3 is gone, but we get a new error. And if we select here, we can say it failed to fetch this object. And this stack is basically showing you the different points in it. So it starts from this HTML file, which calls into main.js, which then calls into this D3 code, which someone else has written. So we care about here, and we can see this D3.json is a D3 call that is asking for this JSON file. So there's another thing that we actually haven't created yet. So if we go back here, create a new file, and put in a list of 5 numbers, and just save that to use d3.json, right? And if we look back here, it's referencing the current directory, and it's looking for data.json. So if I refresh now, do we have any predictions on, I guess, what will happen next? I see we have some chat questions. Use Chrome, yep. Is it possible to maximize the font size in VS Code? Yes, I will do that. Thank you for pointing that out. And then Hassan, you also asked if did I put the empty file on GitHub. The only thing that is on GitHub is this starter HTML file. Cool. So in terms of predictions, do people have any guesses as to what will happen when I press this button? It won't work. Yes. So if we click it, it gets annoying again, and we get a new error. And this time, so one thing that's helpful here actually, we've sorry, there's some background noise there for a second. We've got a few of these going. So actually one thing that's useful is if you clear this and rerun this again, it can cut down on the clutter just to make it a little easier to see. But the error we care about here is this CORS, this CORS. So this is something you'll see sometimes, stands for cross origin request. This is the wall that we run into when opening this file directly, because your JavaScript is trying to open a file on your computer, basically. And Chrome doesn't let you do this because this is a big security problem if any website could just randomly open a file on your computer. So this is where the Python web server comes in. And actually what I like to do here is I can open another terminal side by side in Chrome. And we are in this parent directory. And for me, since I'm using Python 3, I just go python-m http.server. And we'll see this in the lab slides, but there's two different commands for Python 3 versus Python 2. So now we see we are serving on port 8000, which is just the default. And if I command click into there, I can open that in the wrong window. So I'll just copy that over. No. And then I'll just type it in. And we see here, actually, we get that directory. If you just click into that, you can select this HTML. If you have index.html, it will open that by default, but this also works just fine. Again, inspect this, click that annoying pop-up, and we see our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this because your browser isn't grabbing that file. It's requesting it from this Python server, which is essentially a mini server on your computer. That's grabbing the file and serving it to you. Are there any questions so far? You'll also see when you print data structures, you actually get not just like a text representation of them, but essentially like a little interface that you can click through and look at in a slightly more useful way usually. Control click in Windows does visually. I'm not sure what your question is, Jordan. Does Visual Studio list the hotkeys?
Well, you're using command click, so you're running Mac and you keep saying command this, command that. Would it be control this or control that for Windows or Linux?
Typically, yes. Yep.
And
go ahead.
No, continue if you want to finish wrapping that up.
I was just going to say, I don't have all the commands memorized, but I'm sure there's some nice reference sheets out there for Visual Studio Code, VS Code.
So yeah, my question was, if you already have Python on a computer, do you need to do any sort of, you need to like set up anything to be able to run those servers?
No, so this is a really handy because, here, let me make this not that big. So this HTTP server is like a module on just plain Python that just comes with the standard programming language of Python. So you don't need to like install anything extra if you already have Python installed. Cool. So we're gonna do one last thing here, which is we're gonna add another button for this other function. And if I duplicate this line and copy this function name and rename that, we can refresh. And one quick comment about refreshing, especially now that we have server running, is with web development, there's a lot of caching that happens happens on purpose to try and speed things up, but it can also occasionally make your changes not present right away. So while you have this debugger open in Chrome, if you click and hold on this, you can do a hard reload, or you can completely empty the cache and then do a hard reload. And then obviously, of course, there's these key commands, which maybe not necessary in this case, but sometimes doing, if your changes aren't visible right away, this is something to do to try and pull those in. Or if you see strange errors that don't make sense. But we have this math button. If we click it, we see those 3 numbers. That's great. But what if in your code, those 3 numbers are incorrect? A helpful thing to do is actually set breakpoints in your code and kind of step through that whole process. So again, hopefully they put this link to your code here directly. And if I were to click that, that would open up this sources and go to this main and go to this, line 19, which is where that console.log is actually happening. Let me open this a little bit bigger. But just like any IDE or development tool, you can set breakpoints in here, and I'll just set 2 actually. And if I click this again, it shows me that I'm paused in the debugger. You can watch your different variables. You can step through your code. It kind of has this nice display in here as well as in here. In addition, in the console where you can run JavaScript code, it's now running it as if you were here. So I can also grab A here and B, and it returns the value because effectively we are inside this function. So this is, obviously very useful for, debugging when your code isn't quite working correctly.
Hey, Devin, I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
When you added the extra button, did you have to reserve the Python server, or did it automatically catch those changes? Did it automatically?
Yeah, good question. So you don't need to close and restart the Python server. As I was alluding to before, occasionally, this server is also caching things. So especially if you have an image, it might be cached on that server. So doing this hard reload or clear cache and hard reload can sometimes fix it. I would say if that still isn't working, it's just like debugging a computer. The end thing you can do is turn off the server and turn it back on again. So you can Control-C in here and turn it back on again. But that's should be the extreme. In general, you should be able to change and add and remove files, and it should just take care of that automatically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So in terms of generally getting started, that's what I have. After I've made all of my code changes, I would normally do add them to GitHub. You can do that either in the command line with your normal. Oh, that's right. So I have to actually go into the GitHub folder for this to work and type correctly. So you can do that way. I do want to point out just super quickly in VS Code, there are some there's some nice integration with GitHub. So you can like add your files this way, or if you want to see a nice view of what your changes are, you can see, we've removed the comments and we've added a few of these lines. So you can do all the normal GitHub things through this interface, which is pretty handy, especially this diff view. And that's the end of the demo that I have planned for sort of generally getting started. Any last questions before we move on? Cool. And I just linked in here a couple external resources for, if you're looking back at this. There's a lot of other tools that Chrome has that we didn't go over. And then, as I mentioned, there's slightly different versions for Python 2 and 3. Cool, so let's move on to this observable notebook. If you haven't used observable before, it's kind of a handy way to like update code on the fly and see the changes. So for this, we're gonna go over some of the things that we learned about in D3, and then at the end, we're gonna do like a quick recap of recursion, which is probably gonna be useful if you haven't seen anything with recursion before. In particular, the last example for recursion is gonna be parallel in some ways to your assignment for this week. So yeah, let's just get started here. The first thing we do here is just requiring D3 so that we can use it in our examples. And next we have this SVG code, and above this is where that is ultimately getting displayed. And you'll see it in a few different ways. There's some sort of observable thing. So this is not like standard HTML syntax. This is just for the website observable to know that within this, we have this HTML that we want to display above it. And inside here, we have a single rectangle with a unique ID. And using D3, we can select that specific rectangle with that unique ID, and that returns this D3 selection object. And this selection object has a function called style, which you can call multiple times to set style attributes such as the fill to this color firebrick, or the stroke to black, or the stroke width to the value 4. And I start with this syntax because this is probably a little more familiar to some other programming languages. It was definitely more familiar to me when I first learned D3, but in reality, you'll be seeing it in this sort of style syntax. So this is going to be functionally equivalent. We have a new rectangle with a new unique ID, and we select that rectangle. But now, instead of calling this here multiple times, we just do this style of programming called function chaining. And this works because this selection object will return itself at the end of each function. So it will still style the fill to be firebrick, but after that's done, it's going to return rectangle selection, that object. So you can kind of just chain this multiple times. And in JavaScript, the white space doesn't matter, so I could just as easily put these all on one line. But this sort of tabbing is a convenient way to read it. In the same way you can set style for a single object in D3, you can do it for multiple objects. So here we have a SVG container. Now the container is the one with the unique ID, and then there are these 4 rectangles inside of it. So the first thing I do is we select that container. So this is going to be a D3 selection object that has a pointer to this container. And then we're going to use that to select all. And this is different from select, obviously. But instead of selecting a single thing, it's going to select every single rect object, rectangle object that is inside this selection. And then the same way as before, we have this styling syntax, but the difference is now that this will be applied to every single element inside that rectangle. So it's, you know, again, convenient. You don't have to like write a for loop. You don't have to loop over each element and apply these styles. You just select all of them, and then D3 will apply these styles to all of them as well. Any questions on, you know, D3 selections or this method chaining syntax? Cool. So in this class and in data visualization in general, obviously the styling is generally going to be driven by data that you have. And for our examples, we have this simplified data set, which normally you have actual data, but here we're just going to map directly this radius and border width onto circles. And we're going to be doing this with this draw function, which we're going to reuse later down on the page a few different times. And this draw function takes a string, which is the container ID, that unique identifier, so we can find that exact element, and then the data. So the first thing we do is we grab that container. This variable is now a D3 selection object with a reference to that container ID. Next, we are going to select all of the circles inside of that container, and then we are going to bind them to this data that was passed in. Next, we are going to update all of the circle elements. So notice at this point in the code, we've not actually added any circle elements yet, but if there were any already within this container, we're going to set their fill to this sort of wheat brown white color. After that, we are going to call the selection function that's called enter. And this is, you know, going to return a new selection to the new elements that should be in that list. In other words, if your data has a longer length than the elements that already exist in that container, this will update those. And the first thing we're going to do for each of those is actually add the new element, and then we will style it. And then finally, this last mismatch between data and existing elements, if the data is smaller, we are going to actually remove the SVG elements. And then lastly, we will merge the circles with the enter circles. So in other words, at this point, we want all of the remaining elements that should be there. So we get the new circles, that is this selection, and then we're going to combine those with the existing circles. And then we just overwrite this variable. And then we style this with the you know, based on that data, the X position, Y position, stroke width, and radius. And for these three, we can see that we are, you know, yeah, so to back up, you can specify in this dot attribute a value like we're doing for the Y position. It's just the value of 100, or you can give it a function, and that function will hook into the data that we passed it and use that to compute what should be set for that value. So in this case, we just set the circle 1 to the right by 100 pixels based purely on the index. And in these cases, we look back to this data, grab the radius or the border width. And D in this case is one single object in that list. So for your first element, that D will point to this entire object and so on.
I had one question about this.
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. So were you saying it's towards the top where it says dot data and then data array? So what is happening here? Are you is it like a one-to-one mapping in chronological order between the circles that already exist in the data and the array? Or is it is something else happening here?
Yeah, so to back up one step so I can answer this question, this first part, right, we're selecting all the circles. So this code makes no judgments on what is there beforehand. It could be no circles, it could be a million circles. And then it calls this dot data function. Now this dot data function is a function that exists on D3 selection objects. And after we call this, nothing, just by calling this, nothing is explicitly updated right away. This is basically telling D3 that, this selection object, actually, we're going to want to do stuff related to this data array. And then this code is what is calling into that, referencing that data and making the appropriate changes. But on, this line by itself is really just preparing us for those steps. Yeah, does that answer your question or not so much?
Kind of. I was kind of wondering, let's say you had the data in the data array in a specific order, and then you had the circle elements in the HTML tag in a specific order. Will it actually map those in the correct order?
Yes,
as they appear. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So the order, at least for lists, right, is maintained, and we'll see that when we call this in a second. But yeah, there's an explicit order here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That order is preserved, and when we are styling the width and the radius based on that, the first element that you see will map to that first data element.
I had also had a question. So my interpretation of what's going on here is that, let's say, okay, we're going to have 5 circles total, I think is what it was. And let's say we start off and there's already 2 circles that exist. The color of the fill of those 2 circles would be set to wheat. But we never filled the colors of the other circles anywhere. So yes. Is that intentional? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, that is good.
Okay.
This leads into the next section. What I was gonna say is this, a couple things. This is like a little bit of a complicated thing to wrap your head around in D3, but it is also like one of the most important things to understand. So I would, refer back to this until you can sort of work through it in your mind. And what you're saying is correct. Whether it's desirable or not, in this particular case, I'm just trying to illustrate how it works. If you're trying to, in some scenarios, that's not going to be like a desirable functionality. But we have a few different examples, which I'm hoping will sort of illustrate this. So the first example is going to, we're going to see this line a few times. It's just copying the array from the one that we saw above. And we are going to call this draw circles on the first container that I have set up and pass it this data. And as you kind of pointed out, none of these are filled. So they're black because that's like the default fill color, but this wheat color is not actually set on any of them. And that's because, yeah, I should have this open. All that exists beforehand is a SVG with no rectangles in it. So if we keep going, there's a few different scenarios here. Again, we copy the circles, we call them in the same way, but this time we're going to modify that data array and we're going to add on a few elements. And then we call it again. And this basically gets to that scenario that you're talking about, those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that were in there after this first call, now get set to wheat, and then the last 3 never get their fill set. Are there any questions on what we're seeing here? Cool. And then, yeah, this last example is going to be doing a similar thing, but instead of adding any, it will remove it. And, as I said, this is a very artificial example, but there definitely are scenarios in visualization code where you're going to be doing things and you might get, various lengths of data, and you want to really be sure that all this is handled. And, this sort of style enter, exit, merge is actually more of a historical way that this is done in D3. There's actually easier ways to do this now. But if you can understand this, then understanding the newer ways of doing it becomes quite a lot easier. So if I go down to here, we can see how you could recreate this functionality exactly the same. And that is with this join. So these first couple lines of this function are exactly the same. We get the container, we select all the circles, we bind to the data, but instead of calling this enter or exit or any of that stuff, there's now a join function on these D3 selection objects. And we can call this join in a few different ways. But one way that you can do this is by passing in 3 functions. So you're passing in 3 arguments, and they're 3 different functions. So the first function, behind the scenes, it's kind of doing a similar style thing, but it's a bit easier to read, a little bit more convenient. So for any elements that are entering, any new data elements, we append them and then we style them. For any that were there before, any elements that existed before this call, we simply want to update them. So this update call. And then lastly, any elements that need to be exited, we just call this exit.remove. And we recreate this example where we're adding, and you can see that same exact functionality. So to go back a step, we are calling this function, which I defined here, draw circles with join, with this data set. Then we add 3 new points, and then we call it again. So the first time we call it, these get added and styled. Second time we call it, these get added and styled, and these get updated. Any questions on the sort of join style of using D3?
Yeah, I had a question. Can you scroll up a little bit?
Sure.
Thank you. So if we're looking here, let's say that we wanted everything to be black and firebrick stroke. Would it make sense here to just create a function that sets those attributes on basically everything after append, and then call that every single time? Does that make sense?
So is your question, instead of seeing different styles, do you want everything to be the same? Is that your question?
So I want
Or is
everything
it
to be the
something else?
same. Yeah, basically, would it make sense to just have a function there that you could somehow pass update to, and then say set the attributes x and cy, set the attribute stroke, set the attribute stroke width, attribute radius. On
Yeah,
the
So definitely something like that could work, but this actually leads into the very next section, which uses, there's a different way you can call join, which actually does this. So let me just scroll down to it.
Great.
And to be honest, this is actually how me and my work and most of the things I do am going to use join. So if we remember up above, join took 3 parameters, each one was a function. This join, all this is the same, takes a single parameter. And instead of a function, it's a string. And the behavior you get is a little bit different. And the intention of this is for scenarios where, whatever data you have, you just want to display everything the same, whether it's new or leaving or updated. And this is what I'm going to style it to. So if we look at this example, right, we're going to call it in the same way, call it once, add 3 data points and call it again. Here, we finally get everything styled the same way. And this, like I said, is obviously the simplest code of everything we've seen today once you kind of understand how it works, and it is a fairly common use case. I guess one question I have in regards to this that I would ask you all is, we have these 2 different joins. I guess what would be the use case for, sounds like we have a scenario where this is useful, but do we have a scenario where this other version of the code could be useful?
It could be used if you are like adding data periodically and you want to see the most recent thing that was added.
So if you want to see the most recent thing, so then your updates would maybe like be pushed into the old section, and the enters would be like the promoted ones in some way.
Yeah, yep, that's exactly it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good example. Are there any other thoughts? Cool. So one I would point out, I wish I had thought to find an actual demonstration of this, but if you are doing something a little bit fancier than just deleting the elements, which is what this remove does. So for example, if you want to, as your elements are added, like fly in or animate in or like bubble into existence, and then as they remove, instead of just disappearing, they could bubble out or fly out or dissolve out. Doing something like this is really going to be, necessary for that like different behavior for elements that are entering compared to updated, and then obviously having access to this is going to be necessary for like modifying that exit function. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. That covers what I had planned for D3. Before I move on to recursion, are there any last questions about D3 selections or other D3 or JavaScript things? Cool. Great. So recursion is essentially it's a function that within the body of that function calls itself. So we have kind of a simple example here called a countdown function. And this function is going to take two parameters. The first one is the value, and the second is what we're calling a keeper, which is keeping track of the values that have happened so far. And to be specific, it's a JavaScript list of numbers. So the idea being, yeah, so the first thing we do is we just push that current value onto that list. That will push it to the end of this keeper array. And in recursive functions, you'll see, a few different things. Importantly, you need a way to terminate the function. Otherwise, you're going to get like a call stack has, like exceeded the maximum. And obviously, by definition, you'll need a recursive call for itself. So we are counting down to 0 if the value is equal to 0, or somehow someone's passed it something less than 0. We're done. We're going to return our final output, which is this list of numbers, which we are keeping track of. Otherwise, that means we have a positive number, and we're going to do this recursive call. We've already pushed the value onto the array here, so we're going to call this again with a value 1 less than it currently is. And as you can imagine, obviously that's going to keep going down until it reaches this termination condition. So it's important that with recursive functions that it will at some point, terminate. And we can see in this example what it looks like when we actually call it. We'll call it with a number 10 and an empty array, and it ultimately returns this list 10, 9, 8, 0, 1. Does that make sense? Any questions? Cool. So in terms of why and when you use recursive functions, it's in this particular case, I wouldn't. If I just wanted a list from 10 to 0, I would probably write this iteratively and like a for loop. And in general, it's like any recursive function you could write iteratively, but there are some that it's going to be a lot more, you'd say the elegant solution would be to use a recursive function. And this actually happens a lot with tree data structures. So one example of a tree data structure would be your directory on your computer. And I've kind of like a fake version of that here, where you have the base folder, and inside that folder, you could have files and other folders. And if it's a file, in this particular case, all I care about is the size of that file. So really just the metadata of that file, how big it is. And a question you may have is, for this folder, how big is, how much space is being taken up by that folder and all of its children and children's children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you get to a file. So we have this recursive function called calculate file size. It takes a file object. Here again, we have that terminal condition. And that will happen once we reach a file. A file can't have children, only folders can. In that case, we expect files to have this size attribute, so we'll just return that. Otherwise, we are going to actually have to have a for loop within our recursive call, because it's perfectly fine. You can have, iteration within your recursion. And we are going to loop over every single child in that folder. So that would get this, right? and we want the sum of all of those children. And we're not going to worry about if it's a file or folder. We're just going to call the recursive function. And we know that, you know, that this will work. We already have this terminal condition. And then we're going to add that to our sum and then return that ultimately. And, you know, this is like fairly easy to see after it's done and you're reading through it, but the sort of a trick with recursive functions I find is that you kind of have to play this mind trick of like, okay, let's assume that this function works and is all done. And once you have that in your mind, then you can like, it makes it a lot easier to call it within that function in a way that is helpful. So that was a little bit of a mouthful, but recursive functions can be, they're the hardest code to write that ends up taking like 5 lines of code in my experience. But once you're done, you're like, oh, that's cool. Yep, and then as an example here, we calculate it. And here again, there's a number of different ways you could solve this. You could do it iteratively, technically, and you could do it recursively in a slightly different way. But I've set it up specifically this way because in your assignment, you're also working with a tree data structure. You are going to have to find the position and the levels. And I would recommend to find those in a way that is recursive. And for the levels, sorry, the position specifically, so the vertical positions of those nodes, you know, there again, there's multiple solutions, but in my opinion, a good solution for that is going to be sort of similar to this in some ways. Yeah, and we are technically at time, and I've just reached the end of what I have prepared to speak, but I'm happy to stay on and answer questions as long as there are questions.
I had 2 quick questions. The first one was actually part of the first half of what you're talking about. And if you were basically like you're importing scripts into main in the VS Code, if you have like the same function call for the same function name, can you like differentiate those by like the name of your .js file or anyway? So like, let's just say you have like calculate mean in 2 different JavaScript files. Could you be like circles.calculate mean or, you know, rectangle.calculate mean, or is that you following that?
Yeah. So it sounds like your question is if in 2 different files you have 2 different functions that have the same name, how do you deal with that?
Correct.
Yeah. What I would do is, you know, I generally like to put them within classes. So to answer your question, by default, if you just have 2 random functions in 2 different files just sitting there, I'm not sure what would happen. I think they're both in the global namespace, and one would probably just override the other, probably whichever one gets loaded second or first. I'm just guessing.
Right.
Undefined, basically. You don't want to do that. So you need to wrap one of them, at least, if not both, in some sort of namespace, which in JavaScript I would do by putting it inside of a class. And then to call that function, if it's a static function, you would have that class name dot, and then that function. And then if it's obviously not static, then you need an instance of that class to call it.
Okay. And then the second thing is just kind of like a practical, because I've looked over the homework too a little bit, and how would you kind of approach looking at something? So let's see, like part of it is, for example, like creating like parsing the JSON file or something like that, right? And there's no like main necessarily in like the JSON file? Like, how do you approach like testing that those pieces of it are working? Are you just adding a button on your random HTML that says click and then just like printing stuff to the console log, or how do you go about approaching that?
Yeah, so it sounds like your question is, how do you check parts of your code periodically as you go? Is that correct?
Basically, right. Or some kind of
Yeah.
testing, or I don't know what you use or would suggest using.
Yeah, I think it depends is the general answer. For something small, I generally just like try to make it in the way that I will use it. So I think the usual pattern for your homeworks is you have a main.js, which is the one thing you include, and it will run. And I will either just, if it's simple enough, I will just try to make it work right off the bat. If it's a little bit more complicated, you can like, within main, I might have some like temporary functions for like testing things and then run those. And if it's like a larger project, or if you're working at a company, the de facto answer would probably be to write unit tests as you go. And generally the way people do this is they use, JavaScript like libraries or frameworks for doing those unit tests. And there's a number of these if you're interested. I think the only one I know off the top of my head is Jasmine. And they, basically make it easier to set up things. So like, yeah, in your calculate mean example, you can set up input data, you run it, you test what, you compare the functional answer to what the answer should be. But for small things, it's like, it's kind of hassle, and in my opinion, not worth it for like homeworks, but obviously for like production code that has to be maintained, it's very useful when you like then go and fiddle around stuff. You can check everything with your tests.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Really,
No, I think so. I guess I just have a question then, maybe as a follow-up. Is there like a so when we ran the JavaScript code before, we ran it on a button click.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like something we can add that basically will just like run on HTML load or something like that?
Yeah, so you see my JS right now?
Correct.
Cool. So if I go to main.js, we'll see that right now, both of these are in
functions.
They're in functions.
Gotcha.
And
okay.
Actually, if I just say, do this straight up in the JavaScript file.
Gotcha.
And refresh it. We got
Perfect.
it.
Gotcha.
So you can think of this, yeah, it's like a weird, this whole file is like a weird main, like the main function in your C++ or Java.
Perfect.
And it's a little different because it runs because we can include it. So you can technically include multiple things and they will all run. But yeah.
Okay,
I think
great.
that's answers your question.
Thank you.
Cool. Are there any other questions? We have one in chat. You can also call functions from the console. Yes. Sometimes it's a little tricky depending on where they are to get into them, but so yep. In this case, it's right there in the global namespace, so you can just call it right from here. Cool. Last chance. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good luck with your homework.
Thank you.
Yeah.